You have found your way back, wanderer. Lay down what the day has asked of you. Set it somewhere safe, somewhere outside this room, somewhere it will keep until morning without you needing to hold it. Tonight, you do not need to hold anything. The hours ahead belong to a different kind of dark, not the dark of uncertainty or worry, but the old, patient dark of history, the dark that has already lived through the worst it will ever see, the dark that survived. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere that most voices would not take you. Somewhere that most people speak of quickly, in sentences, in statistics, in the clean, safe distance of numbers. I want to take you there slowly, the way I always take you, without urgency, without rushing toward the catastrophe. Because the catastrophe, when it finally comes, is not the whole story. It has never been the whole story. We begin in the year 1346, in a world that is warm and ordinary and does not yet know what is already moving toward it, traveling on trade winds and merchant ships and the invisible highways of rats and fleas, and the breath between people who trust each other enough to stand close. Europe, in the autumn of 1346, is alive with the sound of itself. The bells of village churches marking the hours, the creak of mill wheels over cold rivers, the particular smell of a market day, bread and animal and damp wool and wood smoke, children running between the stalls while their mothers argue over the price of onions. Old men sitting in the same places they have sat for 40 years, watching the world make its small, familiar movements. They do not know. None of them know. What is coming from the east travels faster than news. It travels faster than horses. It travels in a body itself, in the warmth of a human being who is still walking, still talking, still buying onions and greeting neighbors, who does not yet know that the thing moving through them has already begun to decide the world's next chapter. The Black Death will kill one in every 3 people in Europe. It will arrive in Sicily on a September morning when 12 Genoese trading ships dock at the port of Messina. The port officials who go to meet them will find most of the sailors dead. The ones still alive will be covered in black swellings the size of eggs, at the groin, at the armpit, at the neck, weeping blood and pus. They will smell of something that the officials do not have a word for, something that has no precedent in any living memory. The officials will order the ships out of the harbor immediately. It will already be too late. This is the night we spend together, wanderer, not rushing toward the terror, walking toward it slowly, the way I always walk, with a lamp and enough time and the knowledge that on the other side of this darkness something survives. Something always survives. You do not need to stay awake for all of it. The story will carry you. The voice will remain. We begin where every story of catastrophe must begin, with the world before, with the warmth with the ordinary Tuesday morning that had no idea it was about to become the last Tuesday of a world. In the quiet, we begin. The year is 1346. October is ending. In a village in Burgundy, a collection of perhaps 40 or 50 houses arranged along a dirt road that runs between a mill and a church, the last of the harvest is coming in. The smell of it is everywhere, the sweetness of threshed grain, the earthier smell of turned ground, the wood smoke from a dozen chimneys, all lit at once as the evenings turn cold and the families come in from the fields. The light at this hour is the particular gold of autumn in northern France. Low, slanted, painting everything in the amber of an afternoon that has already started to let go of the day. You wake in this village. You have woken in it every morning of your life, not to silence, but to the sound of a world that begins its business before light. The lowing of cattle in the byre at the end of the house, the creak of someone's door 2 houses down, a dog barking at something real or imagined in the lane, a rooster deciding that this is the appropriate moment without consulting anyone. And beneath all of it, constant and unmistakable, the slow turn of the mill wheel on the stream at the village's edge, which runs all day and much of the night, the sound of the world converting grain into flour, the sound of civilization doing one of the things that most defines it, feeding itself. The house you wake in is 1 room, or perhaps 2 if your family is prosperous. A main room where everything happens, and a sleeping loft reachable by wooden rungs nailed to the wall. The walls are plaster over timber frame, patched in places, the patches slightly lighter than the rest. The thatch above you is old enough that in heavy rain you can hear the water finding its path through it. The floor is packed earth, swept clean but still earth. You sleep under wool blankets, rough against the skin, smelling of lanolin and the animal they came from. And beside you is your wife, or your husband, or your children, or some arrangement of all of them, because space is what you have least of, and warmth is what you most need. The first thing you do when you wake is assess the fire. If the fire is still alive, good. If it has gone to ash in the night, you will be cold until someone nurses it back. Fire is not decorative in this world. It is the line between bearable and not. It cooks the food and heats the room and keeps the damp from settling permanently into your bones during the long months between November and March. Every family in this village tends their fire the way later generations will tend investments, with constant attention, with anxiety about what happens if it fails. The village is small, perhaps 150 people, perhaps 200. The census, the kind that medieval administrators attempted intermittently and with results historians have been arguing over for centuries, does not preserve the exact number with confidence. What you know, waking in this house, is who everyone is, not just their names, the whole texture of them. You know that the miller's wife has a laugh that carries from one end of the village to the other, and that the miller has never minded. You know that the blacksmith is better with horses than with people, and that this is generally fine because this village has more horses that need tending than difficult conversations that need managing. You know which families have had a bad year and which ones are comfortable and which ones are going to need help before winter is out, and you know who will give it without being asked and who will wait to be asked and who will give it anyway but will remember they gave it for years. This is the village. This is the whole of the known world for most people who live in it. Life here is organized around the church bell, not the way a clock organizes a modern day, not as a convenience, not as a reminder, but as the fundamental structure of time itself. Prime at dawn, the day begins. Terce at mid-morning, the main work is underway. Sext at noon, the break, if you get one. None in the afternoon, the long middle stretch of labor, the hour when even the hardest worker feels the day's weight. Vespers at dusk. Come in, the light is going. Compline at nightfall. The day is done, and what is done is done. Sleep now. And the year has its own organization. The saints' days that mark the seasons, the great feasts that divide the year into human-scaled portions. The feast of Saint Martin in November, when the slaughter of pigs fills the whole village with smoke and the smell of fat. When the year's last fresh meat is eaten before the long months of salt and preservation. Christmas, with its 12 days of relative rest. Candlemas in February, the light returning, barely, but returning. Easter, which can fall anywhere from late March to late April, and which arrives each year as a genuine relief from the accumulated weight of winter. The Summer Saints' Days. The harvest feast, when the last sheaf is brought in, and even the Lord's steward will raise a cup. The priest knows everyone. He has baptized most of the people currently alive in this village and buried more of their predecessors than he prefers to count. He is not a learned man. The village priest rarely was, in 1346, in a village in Burgundy. He has the words of the Mass in Latin and the basic framework of Christian teaching and the particular social intelligence that surviving among one community for 20 years gives a person. He knows who drinks too much and who is generous with their bread and who carries a grudge. He hears confession and assigns penances that are calibrated not to theological precision, but to what will actually prompt the sinner to change their behavior, which requires knowing the sinner. He is woven into the place as tightly as the mill wheel is. The seasons organize everything, not as inconvenience or as backdrop, as the fundamental structure of life, the thing all other things are organized around. Spring is sowing, summer is weeding and tending and the anxious watching of weather. Autumn is harvest, the great collective emergency of bringing everything in before the rains come and the cold comes. The work that involves every able body in the village, children and grandparents alongside the strong adults. The one time of year when the distinction between your strip of land and your neighbor's strip temporarily dissolves in the shared urgency of getting the grain in before God changes his mind about the weather. And then winter, the long withdrawal, the world turned inward, the days shortened to almost nothing, animals in the byres, people in the houses, the world reduced for 4 months to what could be managed within the radius of a fire's warmth. In winter you repair things. You mend harness and tools. You spin and weave. You make what you will need in the spring from the materials that remain from the autumn. The women spin by firelight, the particular whirring sound of a drop spindle, the scratch of wool being drawn and twisted, while the men sharpen blades and talk and sleep too early, because there is nothing to do when the light is gone and candles are expensive. The stories come out in winter. The old ones, the ones everyone already knows, told again because the telling is the thing, not the novelty of the tale. The stories about the saints, their extraordinary lives, their miracles, their sufferings undertaken with a composure no one you actually know would be capable of, told with the same reverence and the same familiar pleasure as a story told to a child at bedtime. You know how it ends. That is part of why you want to hear it. Disease is always present in this world. Not the plague, nothing like the plague, but the ordinary repertoire of medieval illness. The chest sickness that comes with autumn cold and takes a few of the old and the very young each year. The summer flux, the intestinal illness that follows warm weather and bad water that can kill children quickly if they cannot keep enough liquid in them. The fevers, indefinite, various, sometimes resolving in a week and sometimes not. Wounds that go bad because there is no understanding of infection and no means to prevent it, only the practice of cauterization and prayer and the particular tough survival probability of someone young enough to fight it off. Childbirth, which kills a fraction of the women who attempt it, often enough to be part of the background understanding of what marriage means for a woman in this world. People in this village know death. It lives in the house next door. It sometimes comes for children in the night. It comes for the old without much ceremony, and for the not old occasionally, and for the young sometimes, and you bury them in the churchyard and say the prayers and go back to the harvest. It is not that the deaths do not matter. They matter enormously. The mourning here is real, and the grief is real, and a woman who loses a child carries that loss in her body for the rest of her life. But death is not shocking in this world. It is not a surprise. It is the known cost of being alive, and everyone has paid some portion of it. What is coming is different. Not death as cost, but death as catastrophe. Not the individual loss that every family has absorbed and survived, but a loss on a scale that has no frame and no precedent and no context in anything that any living person has ever experienced or heard described. The ordinary death of this world, sad, familiar, contained within the human scale, is no preparation for what is on its way. On market days in the nearby town, Thursdays, always Thursdays, the world briefly expands. Suddenly there are strangers, people from villages 8 miles distant, whose faces you do not know, who bring goods you cannot make in the village yourself. Salt, which is necessary and expensive, and comes from the coasts or the salt mines, and must be bought because you cannot make it. Iron tools, repaired or newly made. The blacksmith from a bigger town who does a brisk trade in the shoes of horses and the blades of plows. Spices, pepper and cinnamon and cloves, that come from so far away that most people in this village could not locate their origin on a map, if they had a map, which they do not. Merchants with bolts of fine English wool or good Flemish cloth. On market days you hear news, vague, half-accurate, always delayed news, the kind that travels by mouth and loses pieces of itself each time it is told. News of the king and his wars. News of some dispute in a city 3 days' ride to the east. News from travelers who have come from other places and who sometimes mention, almost in passing, that there is sickness in the east. There is always sickness in the east. The east is a long way away, and everyone knows that the further you go from France, the less settled the world becomes. There have always been plagues in the east. In the stories, the old stories talk about plagues in Egypt, plagues in the Holy Land, plagues in the cities of the old empire. It is the kind of thing that happens to places that are not here. The trading city of Kaffa on the Black Sea in what is now Crimea is more distant than any of these people can easily imagine. It is a Genoese outpost, a place where the goods of Asia arrive by caravan from the steppes and are loaded onto westbound ships. The Genoese ships that trade with Kaffa pass through the Strait of Messina on their way home. But none of that is visible from here, from this village, from this October evening with its smell of grain and wood smoke and the sound of the mill wheel going round. What is visible? The village, the church, the fields now stripped to their stalks, the path to the mill, the priest crossing the common with his hands folded, heading toward the house of someone who is ill. Not plague, just the autumn chest sickness that takes a few people every year, especially the old and the very young. This is the normal attrition of medieval life. People die of cold and hunger and illness and accident and the accumulated wear of a life lived hard. Death is not distant in this world. It lives in the next house. It sits at the table sometimes. You know it. But this is not the death that is coming. The death that is coming has no precedent in anything that is in any living person's experience, or their parents' experience, or their grandparents. It is moving toward them right now, in the holds of ships that have already left Kaffa, in the warm bodies of men who do not yet know they are carrying it across the blue water of the Mediterranean Sea. The village does not know. The last ordinary evening of the last ordinary year will not announce itself. It will simply be an evening like other evenings, the fire lit, the pottage thick with the last of the autumn root vegetables, the children heavy-eyed, the sound of the wind in the thatch. Outside, the village dark and quiet, and beyond the village the dark fields, and beyond the fields the road, and somewhere on that road, though you cannot hear it yet and will not for months, something moving toward you on the current of ordinary human commerce. Something patient, something invisible, something that has no name yet in any language you know. The bells of Vespers are ringing across the village. The sound carries in the cold air farther than it should, that particular resonance of bronze in winter, the sound that has ordered the hours of this world for 300 years. Hold it for a moment. Remember it, because on the island of Sicily, 4 days' sail to the south, 12 ships have just come into port, and the men on the docks who go to inspect them are about to see something they will spend the rest of their lives, however many days remain to them, trying to find words for. The port of Messina was one of the great harbors of the Mediterranean world. Sicily sat at the crossing point of everything. The routes from North Africa, from the Levant, from Byzantium, from Venice and Genoa, from the ports of France and Spain. Ships moved through the Strait of Messina the way blood moves through a heart, constantly, in every direction, carrying the goods and news and people that kept the Mediterranean world alive and profitable and continuously in motion. The harbour officials who walked down to the docks on that October morning in 1347 were doing what harbour officials had done every morning of their working lives. Ships came in. You checked their manifests, their cargo, their passengers. You noted what was taxable, what was prohibited, what required documentation. It was routine work, the unremarkable administration of a port city that had been administering itself in this way for generations. The 12 Genoese trading ships had come from Caffa, on the eastern shores of the Black Sea. They had been a long time at sea. The men on the dock could see that much from the beginning. The ships looked as though they had been sailed hard, with the particular air of vessels that had not been properly maintained during a long crossing. But this was not unusual. Long voyages did that to ships and to the men who crewed them. What was unusual became apparent when the harbour officials went aboard. Most of the sailors were dead. Not dead in the way that sailors sometimes died on long voyages, from storm, from scurvy, from the accumulated toll of weeks at sea without adequate food or fresh water. Dead in a way that the officials, experienced men who had seen the ordinary range of maritime misfortune, did not have a category for. The bodies lay where they had fallen or been moved by the dying crew, on decks, in hammocks, in the hold, and they were marked by something that the officials had to look at twice to believe they were seeing correctly. Black swellings at the groin, at the armpit, at the neck, masses beneath the skin the size of an egg or a small apple, dark and hard and visibly weeping, blood and pus seeping from their surfaces in a thin, continuous ooze. The skin around them was discoloured, purple dark, and the men who were still alive, there were some, fewer than there should have been for a crew this size, were burning with fever. Some were vomiting, some were coughing blood, some had the swellings already and lay holding them with their hands in the way that a person holds a wound, knowing that the holding does not help, but finding it impossible to stop. The smell was everywhere. The officials mentioned it in their reports. Every early account of the plague mentions it, and always with the same reaching quality of a person trying to describe something that exceeded the available language. It was not simply the smell of sickness, of the sick room, of unwashed bodies, of the ordinary unpleasantness that accompanied illness in a world without modern hygiene. It was something deeper and more fundamental than that, something that seemed to be coming from inside the body, from somewhere inside the body that should not be inaccessible, from something that was dissolving that should not dissolve. The harbor officials ordered the ships out of the port immediately. This was, given what they were looking at, a completely rational decision. It was also a decision that came too late by perhaps 12 hours, perhaps 24. Some sailors had already come ashore, a man fetching supplies, a merchant checking on his cargo, the ordinary first contacts between a newly arrived ship and the city it had sailed to reach. The invisible passengers they carried on their bodies and in their breath had already touched the docks and the warehouses and the people who had been there to greet them. The ships left the harbor. They spent the rest of their terrible final journey being turned away from every port they tried to reach: Syracuse, Catania, Genoa, Marseille. Harbor officials on each dock, watching those dark sails approach with a dread they could not fully name, ordering them off before they could dock, watching them move on to the next harbor, the next refusal. The sailors who were still alive when the ships finally ran out of places to go died at sea, or struggled ashore on empty beaches, or simply disappeared from the historical record in the way that people sometimes do when no one is left to write down what happened to them. But in Messina, the dying had already begun. The Franciscan friar Michaelis da Piazza, writing his Chronicle of Sicily shortly after these events, described what he witnessed with the methodical seriousness of a man who understood that he was recording something unprecedented. He wrote of the swellings, which physicians called buboes, from the Greek word for groin, because the groin was their most common first location, growing to the size of a common apple, or sometimes larger. He wrote of what appeared to spread from person to person through breath and through touch. A man who sat beside someone sick in the morning might be sick by evening. He wrote of the vomiting of blood. He wrote of the smell that drove even the most devoted family members from the rooms of their dying. He wrote, most hauntingly, of the speed. A man could be healthy at breakfast and dead before Vespers. 3 to 5 days, in many cases, sometimes 2, sometimes, in the form of the disease that reached the lungs, less. A Genoese notary named Gabriele de Mussis, who was in Kaffa during the Mongol siege and wrote a chronicle of what he had witnessed, described the spread with words that still carry the weight of someone trying to report something they cannot entirely believe they are reporting. He wrote of men falling dead in their doorways, of ships adrift at sea with no living hand to guide them, of the dead piling faster than the living could move them. He was writing for posterity, with the awareness that posterity might not believe him, and he wrote carefully and at length because he needed to be believed. He wrote, "Father abandons child, wife abandons husband, brother abandons brother. Everyone flees, believing they can outrun what they are carrying within them. They could not." What the friar and the notary were both describing in the only language available to them was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that no human eye had yet seen, that would not be named or understood for 5.5 centuries, that lived in the blood of rodents and traveled to human beings through the bite of infected fleas. When a flea that had fed on an infected rat bit a human being, the bacterium entered the human lymph system and began to multiply in the lymph nodes with a speed and efficiency that the human immune system, which had no previous experience of this particular pathogen, was almost entirely unable to match. The lymph nodes swelled as the body threw everything it had at the infection. The swellings that observers called buboes, the external sign of an internal war being catastrophically lost. There were 3 forms of the disease, and understanding all 3 matters to understanding why it killed so many and so fast. The bubonic form was the most common. The classic buboes, the fever, the hemorrhages, the death rate of somewhere between 60 and 70% among those infected. In a world without antibiotics, without intravenous fluids, without any effective treatment whatsoever. Some people survived it, not many, but some. The pneumonic form was worse. When the bacterium established itself in the lungs, the disease became transmissible through the air itself, through the breath, through the moist warmth between 2 people who were standing close enough to speak to each other. No flea bite required, no physical contact, just proximity, just the simple, human, unavoidable act of breathing the same air as someone who was already dying. The pneumonic form killed close to 100% of those it reached. The septicemic form killed the fastest, the bacterium entering the bloodstream directly, overwhelming it before any bubo had time to form. People with this form died with black hemorrhages appearing beneath the skin, the darkening of the flesh that would eventually give the plague one of its names. They died within hours. Some of them died before anyone understood they were sick. The Black Death. In Messina, the citizens did what their instincts told them to do. They fled. They loaded what they could carry, and they left the city for the countryside, for the farms outside the walls, for the relatives in the villages to the south and west, for anywhere that was not here. They did what human beings have always done in the presence of something terrifying in an enclosed space. They moved. They carried the plague with them. They carried it in their bodies, where it was already incubating in the lymph nodes, invisible and patient. They carried it in their clothes, in the seams of wool where fleas traveled undetected. They carried it on the horses and in the carts and in the wagons that moved down the roads away from Messina toward the interior of the island, and the ships that would carry some of them to the mainland. One contemporary account described the spread with an image that has stayed in the historical imagination for 7 centuries. It moved, he wrote, like a fire through dry grass, faster than the fastest messenger, faster than the fastest horse, present in a city before the city had received the news that it was coming. The port officials at Messina had tried. They had ordered the ships away. They had done the obvious, rational thing, and they had done it by any reasonable standard, quickly. It made no difference at all. From Messina, moving north and west, the plague began its work. And the world it was walking into, the warm, connected, busy, commercially sophisticated world of the medieval Mediterranean, was, without knowing it, the perfect vehicle for carrying it further than any plague had ever traveled in recorded history. The ships that were turned away from every harbor they tried to reach eventually ran out of ocean. But the plague had already stepped ashore. It had found the roads, the trade routes, the warm interiors of the carts and wagons and pack horses that moved along those routes in a continuous stream. It had found, in the commercial connectivity of the medieval world, the perfect network for its purposes. By the turn of the year, it was moving north, and it would not stop moving north for 5 years. A plague does not move like an army. An army you can see coming. A smear of dust on the horizon, the sound of hooves on a hard road, the advance riders arriving at a gallop with news that gives you time, however little, to prepare. A plague moves like weather, like a first day of a bad season, which is invisible until the moment it arrives, and by then you are already inside it. In January of 1348, the Black Death reached Marseille, the great port of southern France, the gateway between the Mediterranean world and the interior of Europe, the city through which the goods and passengers of a dozen trading routes passed in the course of a normal winter. Marseille had been doing this work for centuries. It was comfortable with arrival. It knew how to receive ships from the east, how to process their cargoes, how to absorb their passengers into the life of a city that existed precisely because so many things and people passed through it. It was not comfortable with what arrived in January of 1348. The first cases in Marseille were recognizable to anyone who had heard the stories coming up from Sicily. Stories that had been traveling north through the autumn of 1347, distorted with each telling, arriving in Marseille as rumors of a terrible sickness in the south that killed quickly and killed almost everyone. The physicians of Marseille had heard these rumors. They had discussed them in the cautious, authoritative language of 14th century academic medicine. They had, in some cases, written letters to each other debating the likely cause. Then the plague arrived, and the discussions became beside the point. From Marseille, the plague moved along the Rhône Valley, north and inland, following the roads that merchants and pilgrims and soldiers and wandering workers had been traveling for centuries. It moved with the commercial traffic, with the wool bales and the grain carts and the spice merchants and the agents of banking houses with letters of credit tucked into their bags. It moved into the rich agricultural heart of France, into Avignon, where the papal court was located, where an eyewitness physician named Guy de Chauliac watched it arrive and wrote a description that has been read by physicians and historians ever since. Guy de Chauliac was the personal physician to Pope Clement VI. He was, by the standards of his time, an excellent doctor, careful, observant, genuinely interested in understanding what he was seeing. He watched the plague arrive in Avignon in January of 1348, and he noted its behavior with the precision of a man who knew that what he was observing might be the most significant medical event of his lifetime. He noted the two phases. First, a plague that produced the buboes, lasting 2 months, then a different form without the buboes, where people coughed blood and died within 3 days. He noted that the second form seemed to spread simply by breathing near the sick. He noted that he himself eventually contracted the plague and that he survived it. He wrote about surviving it with a candor that is almost startling. He survived, he believed, because he had fled from the sick as much as possible, and because God had apparently decided he had more work to do. He was right that he had more work to do. He would go on to write the most influential medical text of the late medieval period. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI did what he could. He commissioned physicians to conduct autopsies on plague victims. In a world where autopsies were rare and controversial, this was a significant act, trying to understand what the plague was doing to the body from the inside. He issued a papal bull ordering proper burial of the dead when the cemeteries filled. He tried to stop the persecution of Jews that was already beginning in some cities, issuing an explicit statement that the Jews were dying alongside Christians and therefore could not be the cause. And he sat in his chambers with fires burning on both sides of him, fires large enough to make the room extremely hot, because his personal physicians had told him that the heat would purify the air around him. He sat between those fires for months, sweating through the Avignon summer, and emerged uninfected. Whether the fires had anything to do with it, or whether he was simply lucky, or whether the particular kind of exposure that transmitted the disease had not quite reached his heavily guarded papal apartments, we cannot know. He believed the fires helped. He sat between them. In March of 1348, the plague reached Florence. Florence, in the spring of 1348, was at the height of its medieval glory, a city of perhaps 100,000 people, the banking center of Europe, a place of extraordinary commercial sophistication and concentrated wealth, of merchants who could calculate compound interest in their heads and who patronized painters and employed scholars. Giovanni Boccaccio, who would survive the plague and write about it with the unflinching precision of a witness who had seen too much, loved Florence the way you love a place that has made you. He wrote about it with proprietary pride before the plague and with aching loss after it. What Boccaccio described arriving in Florence in March of 1348 is worth pausing over. He was not a physician. He was a writer, a storyteller, a man with a particular attention to human behavior that makes a good narrator. And what he noticed, alongside the medical symptoms, was what the plague did to the social fabric. He described what happened to the dead. First, the ordinary Christian burial, with priest and prayers and mourning family following the body. Then, as the priests died in numbers and the funerals became too many to conduct individually, something more improvised. Neighbors carrying bodies through the streets at night, laying them before churches in the morning. Then the mass graves, layers of bodies covered with earth, covered with more bodies, covered with more earth, in the ground so fast that the rituals that were supposed to accompany death, the prayers, the last rites, the mourning, were compressed into minutes or abandoned altogether. Then at last, the carts, moving through the streets at night, driven by men who wrap their faces in cloth, calling in the dark for the dead to be brought out. He described what happened to the living, which was in some ways harder to write about. people stopped going near the sick. Not all people, he was careful to note that, but many people, more than he would have expected, more than the Christian tradition of care for the suffering seemed to demand. Men who had spent their adult lives performing the corporal works of mercy, visiting the sick, burying the dead, found themselves unable to enter the rooms of their dying neighbors. Parents, he wrote with a directness that still carries the weight of his disbelief, refused to tend their sick children. Children refused their sick parents. Husbands and wives separated, each fearing the other. He did not write this as accusation. He wrote it as observation, as the honest record of what catastrophe revealed about the gap between what people believed they were and what they actually were when the test arrived. Florence lost perhaps 60,000 of its 100,000 inhabitants in the plague of 1348. Some historians argue for lower numbers. Some think certain neighborhoods lost even more. What is beyond debate is that the most sophisticated city in Europe was reduced in the spring of that year to a place where the dead lay in the streets, and the bells rang for the departed so continuously that eventually the authorities ordered them stopped. From Florence, the plague moved north through Italy, into Venice, which tried harder than almost any other city to stop it, posting guards at the causeways, turning away incoming ships, establishing islands in the lagoon for the isolation and burial of the dead. Venice's measures helped at the margins. Venice still lost perhaps half its population. Through the Alpine passes in the summer of 1348, moving with the merchants and pilgrims who crossed the mountains, regardless of what was happening in the cities below, because the mountains were on their route, and their route was their livelihood, and stopping entirely was a different kind of death. Into Germany and Austria, into the great Rhineland cities where Gothic cathedrals rose above the market squares, and the guilds of merchants and craftsmen had made themselves wealthy on the trade that connected northern Europe to the south. Into France, where Paris, a city of perhaps 80,000, the capital of the largest kingdom in Europe, a city of university scholars and royal administrators and merchants from every province, received the plague in the autumn of 1348. The king and his court retreated to the countryside. They left Paris to manage as it could, and the plague crossed the water. In June of 1348, it arrived at the port of Weymouth on the English south coast. The specific ship is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded is that the dying began in Weymouth in the summer of 1348 and moved east through Dorset and into Somerset and Hampshire through the autumn and reached London by the close of the year. London, crowded, dirty, its water supply and its waste disposal running in close proximity, was devastated. The great cemetery at Smithfield, which the monks of the nearby priory maintained, filled within weeks and had to be extended, and then extended again. The monks themselves died in such numbers that the priory nearly ceased to function. By the spring of 1349, the plague was in every county of England. The rhythm was the same everywhere. First the rumors, word traveling ahead by returning traveler or panicked messenger that something was happening to the south or the east or the west. Then the first cases, which might be misread for days as ordinary autumn sickness until the bubo formed and removed all ambiguity. Then the dying, faster than the grave diggers could work, faster than the priests could administer last rites, faster than any city administration could respond in any organized way. In 1349, Norway, where the plague arrived by ship at the port of Bergen and moved inland along the fjords and river valleys into communities that had no warning and no preparation, and in some cases, no survivors. Archaeologists working in Norway have found abandoned medieval farms. The houses left as they were on the last day their occupants were alive. Everything in place, no one there. Communities simply erased. Eastern Europe followed. Poland, Hungary, the territories further east. Some regions, through luck or isolation, or the particular chance of trade routes not passing through them at the wrong season, were spared. Milan attempted an extreme form of containment. When plague appeared in a house, the authorities sealed the entire house, the sick and the well alike, inside it, and left food at the door and waited. It was brutal. It was not entirely ineffective. Milan lost fewer people than most Italian cities. Most places did not have Milan's particular combination of ruthless administration and geographic luck. Most places simply died. By the time the worst of the first wave had exhausted itself, somewhere around 1353, in most of Europe, the plague had killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the continent's total population. The range is wide because the medieval records that survive are incomplete, and because death on this scale disrupted the very record-keeping that might have documented it. What we know with confidence is that some regions lost more than half their people, that some lost less than a quarter, that the average across all of Europe was somewhere around a third. 1 in 3 people gone in 5 years. And here is the thing that the numbers obscure, the thing that only becomes visible when you try to hold the numbers against the human scale of a medieval village. Every village with 60 people had lost 20. Every city with 100,000 had lost 30 or 40,000. Every monastery, every guild, every hospital, every school, every institution that required human beings to function had lost the portion of its human beings that kept it running. And some of those functions simply stopped. Some of them did not start again for a generation. The world that had been so ordinary in the autumn of 1346 was gone. Not changed, not diminished, gone. What remained was a different world, a world walking through the ruins of itself, trying to understand what it was now that so much of what it had been was in the ground. The dead are beyond any single person's ability to count or comprehend. The living are left with the impossible work of making meaning from what has happened, of explaining to themselves and to their children and to the God they still believe in why this happened and what it means and what they are supposed to do now. In a world that organized meaning through God and through the church and through the particular certainties of Christian cosmology, this was not a small problem. It was the largest problem anyone alive had ever faced. And the answers that people reached for tell us as much about the human capacity for response as they do about the 14th century. In the autumn of 1349, in the cities of Germany and the Low Countries, something appeared on the roads that had no precedent in ordinary Christian observance. Groups of men, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, walking in long columns through the streets of towns and cities, bare to the waist despite the cold, carrying leather straps weighted at the tips with iron spikes, beating themselves across the back and shoulders with a practiced rhythmic motion, singing as they walked. Not cheerful songs, the penitential psalms, the great cries of human unworthiness addressed to a God who had, they believed, sent this catastrophe as punishment for human sin, and who might, if the punishment of the flesh was sufficient, relent. They were called flagellants, from the Latin word for whip, and they believed, with the complete conviction of people who have no other framework available, that if they could demonstrate through their own suffering how seriously they took the weight of human sin, if they could show God in the most visceral and undeniable way that they understood they deserved what had happened, perhaps God would be satisfied. Perhaps the plague would stop. They traveled from city to city in organized companies. A flagellant company traveled for 33 days, one day for each year of Christ's earthly life. During those 33 days, members were not permitted to speak to women, to bathe, to change their clothes, or to sleep in beds. Twice a day, the company stopped in a public place and performed the ritual, the leader calling out the sins of the flesh, the members falling to the ground at specific moments, rising again at a signal, continuing the march. Their backs were cut and bleeding. The iron tips of the straps tore the skin. They bled in the city squares, and the crowds gathered to watch, and some of the watchers joined them because the logic was available to anyone who was desperate enough. Something has gone wrong at the level of the cosmos. The Church's ordinary mechanisms of penance, confession, assigned prayers, acts of charity, seemed insufficient for a catastrophe of this scale. What was needed was something proportionate, something that matched the enormousness of what God appeared to be angry about. The flagellant movement was not small or marginal. It had hundreds of thousands of adherents across Germany, the Low Countries, France, Switzerland, and into Poland. It had leaders with genuine organizational ability. It had its own theology, its own songs, its own rituals. It was, in the most literal sense, a mass movement, born from mass suffering, organized around mass action, addressing itself to a God whom the participants held responsible for mass death. Pope Clement VI condemned it in 1349. He condemned it carefully on specific theological grounds. The flagellants were claiming that their self-inflicted suffering was sufficient for the forgiveness of sins without the mediation of the sacraments, without the authority of the Church. They were, in the technical language of the period, heretical. His bull was issued, his authority was asserted, and the movement largely faded from the roads within months. But the plague did not stop. When self-punishment did not satisfy God, and the dead kept dying, and the framework of divine punishment for sin produced no coherent explanation for why the virtuous were dying alongside the sinful. When the theology failed to explain the experience, the people who were looking for an explanation turned toward an easier target. The Jews of Europe had been objects of suspicion, restriction, and periodic violence for centuries before 1348. They lived in separate quarters, under separate laws, prohibited from most trades, required in many places to wear distinctive clothing, excluded from the guilds that organized Christian economic life. They were the designated outsider in a world that organized meaning through Christian identity, and outsiders, in times of extreme crisis, become the available explanation for what cannot otherwise be explained. In the spring of 1348, rumors began to circulate. The Jews, people said, were poisoning the wells. They were spreading the plague deliberately as agents of the devil, as part of some conspiracy against Christian civilization. They were the cause. There was no evidence for this. The accusation was not only false, but logically incoherent. The Jews were dying of the plague at rates comparable to their Christian neighbors, which Pope Clement VI explicitly pointed out when he issued a bull in September of 1348, prohibiting attacks on Jewish communities. The Jews, he wrote, were dying everywhere like other people. This should demonstrate that they were not responsible. He ordered that they be protected. The papal bull was issued, was read in the relevant cities, and was, in most places, set aside. In February of 1349 in Strasbourg, a city where the plague had not yet fully arrived, whose city council had argued against the persecution precisely because there was, as yet, nothing to blame anyone for. A faction with different political allegiances gained control of the council. What happened next was organized and deliberate and done in public. 2,000 Jews were led to the Jewish cemetery and burned alive. The children were offered baptism and conversion, and thus survival. Those who refused were burned with their parents. The property of the dead was confiscated and distributed. Jews throughout the city were imprisoned or killed or expelled. Strasbourg was not unique. It was not even the worst. In Basel, in Freiburg, in Mainz, in Cologne, in Frankfurt, across the cities of Germany and the Rhine Valley, Jewish communities were attacked, burned in their synagogues, expelled from their cities, killed in the streets. Some communities were protected by local rulers or bishops who retained enough moral clarity to refuse the logic. Frederick of Meissen in Germany, the Margrave of Brandenburg. But they were the exceptions. Most were not. What happened to the Jewish communities of Europe in 1348 and 1349 was among the worst episodes of organized violence against Jewish people in European history before the 20th century. It happened because a catastrophe that had no visible cause required a visible cause, and the people who were already designated as outsiders, who had been designated as such for generations, in theological language that made them available for blame, were the most convenient available. The rage that could not be directed at an invisible bacterium was directed at people who could be seen and reached and punished. The physicians were doing what they could, which was, in honest assessment of the 14th century's medical toolkit, very little. The physicians of medieval Europe were not ignorant men. Many of them were learned scholars who had spent years studying Hippocrates and Galen and the great Arabic physician Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was the standard medical textbook of the era. They had a sophisticated understanding of the human body as those texts described it, and they could discuss theory and diagnosis and treatment in impressive detail. The problem was that those texts were wrong about the cause of epidemic disease, and you cannot treat a disease at its cause if you do not know what the cause is. The dominant theory was miasma, bad air, rising from corrupted ground or stagnant water, or the particular alignment of celestial bodies that disturbed the balance of the atmosphere. If you breathed miasmatic air, your own internal humors, the four fundamental substances that medieval medicine believed governed health, became imbalanced and sickness followed. Treatment meant rebalancing the humors, bleeding the patient to reduce excess blood, prescribing herbs whose properties addressed the specific imbalance observed, advising against the foods and activities that would make the imbalance worse. None of this helped against the plague. Some of it actively harmed patients already weakened by fever and dehydration. Some physicians tried lancing the buboes, puncturing the swellings to drain them, which occasionally produced relief and occasionally introduced secondary infections that killed the patient faster. Some prescribed theriac, an ancient compound antidote that had been used against poisons since Greek antiquity, and that contained, in some formulations, as many as 65 ingredients, including viper's flesh and opium. It did not address Yersinia pestis in any medically meaningful way. Some prescribed flight, leave the infected area, travel to higher and cooler ground, breathe different air. This was the only advice that consistently helped. And it helped not because of the air, but because it increased the distance between the doctor and the infected fleas. The protective equipment that some physicians wore has become one of the most haunting images of the plague era. The long black gown, the leather gloves, the wide-brimmed hat, and the beak mask. A leather mask shaped like a bird's face, with a long curved beak stuffed with dried herbs and spices through which the physician breathed. The herbs were meant to filter the miasma. The image is correct in its instinct. Something between the physician's airway and the patient's breath was needed, but wrong in its execution because miasma was not the vector and herbs did not stop bacteria. The beak mask became iconic because it looked like what it was, a desperate attempt at protection by people who understood that something was being transmitted but did not understand how. Many doctors fled the cities. Many of them survived as a result. Some stayed. Some physicians remained in their cities and continued to treat patients and documented what they saw with the care that has made their records invaluable to historians and epidemiologists ever since. These men knew what they were risking. They did it anyway. Their names are mostly lost, except to the scholars who specialize in them. Their notes survive. The clergy faced the same choice and bore the additional weight of theological requirement. The dying needed their priests, not for comfort only, for salvation. The last rites were not optional in 14th century Christian theology. To die without confession, without absolution, without a final anointing of the sick, this was a spiritual catastrophe. The dying knew it. They asked for priests. They needed priests. Half the clergy of England are estimated to have died in the plague years. In some dioceses, the mortality was higher. The communities of monks and friars who did the work of nursing the sick, the Franciscans and Dominicans, who had built their houses in the cities precisely to serve the urban poor, died at rates that crippled their orders. They were dying because they were doing what their vows required, because proximity to the suffering was their vocation, because the man dying in the ditch was the image of Christ and required attendance. Bishops struggled to replace the dead clergy with men prepared for the work. They accepted ordinations they would have refused in ordinary years. Men with less education, less preparation, ordained in weeks rather than months, because the gap between what the dying needed and what the institution could provide was too large to close with ordinary methods. The rules bent under the pressure of reality. Some bishops issued dispensations allowing the dying to confess to lay people if no priest could be reached, an extraordinary concession in a tradition that had always required clerical mediation for sacramental efficacy. The dying could confess their sins to another ordinary person, and God would understand. This was theology responding to catastrophe, and the response was both generous and quietly devastating, because it acknowledged that the institution could not meet the need. And then there were those who abandoned entirely. Boccaccio wrote about it without indulgence, without editorializing, just the flat record of what he had seen. Parents who refused to go near their sick children, children who abandoned sick parents, spouses who left spouses, neighbors who passed by infected houses on the far side of the street, pressing cloths to their faces, eyes averted from the people inside calling for help. He was not condemning these people. He was observing them. He was noting that the fear was not irrational, that going near the sick did spread the plague, that many of the people who stayed to nurse the dying contracted the disease and died of it. The abandonment was morally terrible and pragmatically rational in the same moment. This is what the plague did. It put people in situations where the morally required action and the survival-maximizing action were in direct conflict, and then it watched what they chose. Some chose to stay. The wife who held her dying husband's hand for 5 days and was dead herself a week later. The nun who nursed strangers in the hospital until she sickened, and her sisters nursed her in turn, and many of them died. The priest who answered every call for last rites in his parish until he ran out of time. Some chose to leave. The father who took his healthy children and went to the country estate and locked the gate and tried not to think about the village. The physician who departed the city with his most important books and his savings and the horse he'd bought for exactly this contingency. Most people did both in different moments of the same terrible weeks. Stayed until staying became too much, then left, or left first and returned when guilt became heavier than a fear, or sent money and food to the door without going in, which was both cowardice and generosity in the same gesture. The Venetian authorities in 1348 established a commission of 3 noblemen charged with the management of the dead, organizing the transport and burial of plague victims, ensuring the graves were dug and the bodies reached them. It was the most modest possible beginning of something that would eventually become enormously significant. A small, exhausted, inadequate commission doing death administration on a scale that had never been attempted. From this tiny beginning, something that the world had never had before would eventually grow. But that is the next story. For now, the dying continues. The flagellants have moved on to the next city. The fires in the Jewish quarter have gone out. The physicians in their beak masks are doing what they can with what they have, and what they have is almost nothing. And in the churches, on the walls, the painters are beginning to sketch the outlines of something new. A figure, a skeleton, grinning with the fixed democracy of the dead, reaching out its hand toward a man in a crown. "Come," says the skeleton. "It is your turn now. It always was." The first wave exhausted itself by 1353 in most of Europe, not because it was cured or conquered, but because it had moved through the available population faster than the available population could replenish itself. Subsequent waves returned in 1361, 1368, 1375, and again throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The plague would not leave Europe entirely for 300 years. But the world that remained in the aftermath of the first wave was not the world of 1346, and it would never again be that world. The survivors were building something new, though they did not yet know it, and the building was happening in the wreckage. Walk through Florence in 1353, and you will find a city that looks, from a distance, much as it looked before. The great churches are standing. The palaces of the banking families are intact. The Arno runs beneath its bridges. The bells mark their hours. The markets have opened again on their usual days. But the distances between people are different. The silences are heavier. The houses at the end of certain streets are closed in a permanent way. Not closed for a holiday or a journey, but closed the way a house is closed when its last inhabitant has died and no one has come to claim it. Gardens gone to wilderness in a single season. A street that used to smell of a particular baker's bread is quiet now. The baker is gone. His apprentice is gone. The customers who came every morning are mostly gone. The world the plague left behind was not simply damaged, it was rearranged. and the rearranging had consequences that reached further than anyone walking those quiet Florentine streets in 1353 could have fully anticipated. The labor shortage was immediate and enormous. Before the plague, the European economy had a surplus of agricultural workers. There were more people who needed work than there was work available for them, and this surplus was the foundation of the feudal system. It allowed lords to set the terms of labor at almost any level they chose. The serf, who worked 3 days a week unpaid on his lord's land and rented the rest of his time at whatever the lord cared to charge, had no leverage. There was always someone willing to take his place. The system was stable because the supply of labor exceeded the demand for it. After the plague, 1 in 3 of those workers was dead. The land that needed ploughing had not shrunk. The sheep that needed shearing were still there. The grain that needed harvesting had not become easier to harvest, but the people available to do these things had decreased by 1/3 across all of Europe, and by more than that in the cities and the regions hit hardest. This meant, with the mathematical simplicity of supply and demand, that the people still alive and still capable of doing the work were for the first time in most of their lives able to negotiate. They asked for higher wages. Some lords paid, others refused and found their workers had simply walked to the next estate, where another lord, equally desperate for labor, was willing to meet their terms. The movement of peasants who had technically been bound to specific manners became a phenomenon that the ruling class found both incomprehensible and infuriating, because it violated the entire logic on which their authority rested. The English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to legislate wages back to pre-plague levels and prohibit workers from moving between lords. It was enforced in some places for some years. It could not permanently succeed because you cannot legislate away the economics of a labor shortage by declaring that the shortage does not change the price. Workers who knew they were scarce, who had grown up in households where the plague's rearrangement of labor value was simply part of how things worked, were not going to accept the pretense that nothing had changed. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, when rural workers marched on London, burned the records of manorial obligation, killed lawyers and tax collectors, briefly occupied the Tower of London, and presented demands to the young King Richard II that would have effectively ended serfdom, was the product of many pressures: unfair taxation, resentment of church wealth, the particular political frustrations of a specific moment. But it was also the product of 3 decades of changed expectations. The peasants of 1381 were the children of the survivors of 1348. And they had grown up in a world where the value of their labor was a fact that even the most powerful lord could not entirely pretend away. Similar upheavals rippled across France, across Germany, across the Italian city-states throughout the second half of the 14th century. Everywhere the plague had thinned the labor supply, the survivors were living in a different relationship with the powerful, not an equal relationship, not yet, and not without violence and suppression and decades of grinding resistance, but different. The feudal hierarchy that had seemed permanent and God-given in 1346 was revealed in the aftermath of the plague as a human arrangement. And human arrangements can be renegotiated. By the late 15th century, serfdom had largely disappeared from England and was in retreat across much of Western Europe. The transformation was slow and contested and accompanied by real suffering. It was also irreversible. On the walls of churches across Europe, a new image was appearing: the danse macabre, the dance of death. It always looked something like this: a procession of figures alternating between the living and the dead. The dead are skeletons, but dancing skeletons, grinning, sometimes playing musical instruments with an energy that is almost celebratory in its relentlessness. And they are leading the living: a pope, then a skeleton, a king, then a skeleton, a bishop, a knight, a merchant, a craftsman, a laborer, a child. Each rank of society, each age and station, paired with its smiling skeletal partner. The image made an argument that medieval Christianity already had the theological vocabulary for, but that the plague had driven home in a way that no theological language could fully capture. Death comes for everyone. Not the sinful more than the virtuous, not the old before the young, not the poor before the rich. The skeleton reaches equally for the Pope's white-gloved hand and the peasant's roughened one. The dance is the same for both. No privilege extends past the boundary. It was not a new idea, but it was a newly urgent one. The people who painted these images on church walls had watched popes die, and peasants die, and priests die, and children die, and wise men die, and fools die with the same indiscriminate efficiency. They were not painting a theological argument. They were painting what they had seen. The Decameron was Giovanni Boccaccio's response to the same experience, and it arrived at a different place. He wrote the frame of the book in the immediate aftermath of the Florentine plague. 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, flee the city as the plague reaches its peak and retreat to a villa in the hills outside Florence. There, in voluntary quarantine, they organize themselves a life of order and beauty and conversation to contrast with the chaos below. Each day, they tell each other stories. 10 days, 10 people, 1 story each. 100 stories in total, on rotating themes. The stories are not about the plague. They are about love and cleverness and deception and desire and the full comic range of human misbehavior. Some are bawdy in ways the church found difficult. Many are funny. All of them celebrate intelligence and beauty and the particular pleasure of a story told well by someone who enjoys the telling. The Decameron is a book written in the shadow of mass death, and it is stubbornly, defiantly, joyfully alive. It insists on the value of earthly experience. It insists on love and laughter and good food and clever women and foolish monks and all the material abundance of human life, precisely because the world has just demonstrated that all of it can be taken away in an afternoon. The response to that knowledge, Boccaccio seems to say, is not renunciation. It is more living while living is still available. Petrarch, the poet who had spent years writing love verses to a woman named Laura, who died of plague in April of 1348, found himself in the aftermath of loss trying to locate his place in the New World. He wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to friends and scholars and correspondents across Europe, thinking through what it meant to be among the survivors, what it meant to carry the weight of the dead, what it meant to keep writing when the world had given you such abundant material for grief and had simultaneously removed so many of the people you might have wanted to share the writing with. He kept writing. So did Boccaccio. So did the anonymous painters of the Dance of Death. The impulse to make something, to record, to shape, to give form to what had been experienced, was itself a form of insistence that the dead would not go unwitnessed, that the living would not simply endure the catastrophe, but would understand it. The church that emerged from the plague years was subtly but irreversibly changed. Not because the faith itself had failed. Most survivors were as Christian as they had been before, perhaps more intensely so. But because the church's human representatives and theological framework had failed in visible and specific ways that could not be entirely papered over. The priests who fled, the bishops who could not explain why the good died alongside the wicked. The theology of divine punishment applied to a catastrophe that had killed the devout alongside the sinful, the innocent alongside the guilty, with no apparent moral discrimination whatsoever. People did not stop believing, but larger numbers began looking for ways of believing that felt more personal, more direct, less dependent on institutions that had proven, in the years of the plague, to be made of ordinary and fallible human material. Mystical movements grew, private, interior, experiential, seeking a relationship with the divine that did not require the church as intermediary. Flagellants seeking direct embodied communication with God through the suffering of the flesh. Beguiners and brethren of the common life, developing forms of contemplative piety that could be practiced by lay people without clerical guidance. The manuscript tradition of devotional writing, texts like the Imitation of Christ, growing alongside the growing appetite for a Christianity that could be felt as well as administered. This was not yet the Reformation. That was more than a century and a half away. But the soil that would eventually nourish it was being turned over in these years, in the hearts of people who had prayed and lost everything, who had prayed and watched their priests run, who had prayed and found that the answers the institution gave them no longer quite fit the experience they had lived through. Something was loosening. Something was being made available to question that had not been available to question before. The world building itself in the aftermath of the plague did not know what it was building. It was too close to the loss to see the shape of what the loss was making possible. What the survivors knew was grief and labor and the hard daily work of continuation. What they were making, slowly, in ways that would only become visible to later centuries, was a different relationship with authority, with mortality, with the individual self, and with the possibility that the world could be understood on terms other than the ones inherited from tradition. Out of the wreckage, always, come the things that the intact world would never have allowed. Not because catastrophe is good. It is not. It is terrible, and the cost of what was lost here is never recoverable. But because catastrophe breaks open what stability keeps closed. Because people who have watched their entire inherited framework fail to explain and protect them are people who become sometimes capable of trying something genuinely different. The survivors of the Black Death did not set out to remake the world. They set out to survive. And in surviving, and in the particular ways they chose to survive, they built things that the world before the plague had not imagined and could not have allowed. In the year 1377, 30 years after the first ships docked at Messina, the city-state of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast of the Adriatic Sea issued a decree. Ships arriving at Ragusa's harbour from ports where plague was known to be active would not be permitted to dock immediately. They would be required to wait, anchored at a designated island off a coast, for a set period before any contact with the city was permitted. The waiting period was initially 30 days, a Trentino. It was later extended to 40 days, a period thought more reliable for determining whether travelers who appeared healthy had in fact escaped infection. 40 days in Italian is quarantina giorni. From this word, first used in this context in this Adriatic city in this year, we get our word quarantine. The decree was not based on a correct understanding of how plague was transmitted. The physicians and administrators of Ragusa did not know about bacteria. They did not know about flea vectors or lymphatic infection or any of the mechanisms we now understand. What they knew was pragmatic and attainable. They knew that people who arrived from plague-infected areas sometimes arrived already sick, and that the sickness seemed to spread from those people to others. They knew that separating new arrivals for a period of time seemed to reduce that spread. They did not know why it worked. They knew that it did. This is the beginning of public health as a formal government responsibility, not as charity. The Church had organized care for the sick for centuries, and this was not that. Not as medical treatment. The physicians had their practices, and this was not that either. This was something new, an organized state intervention, backed by law, enforced by authority, designed to protect the population as a whole through the systematic management of collective risk. The individual's freedom of movement, the merchant's ability to dock his ship and conduct his business, subordinated to the health of the community. Venice, which had been improvising public health responses since 1348, formalized these improvisations into permanent institutions over the following decades. By the 1420s, Venice had standing health magistrates, the provveditori alla sanità, with permanent staff, dedicated quarantine facilities on islands in the lagoon, and a system of health certificates issued to travelers arriving from regions known to be uninfected. Ships without health certificates were detained. Travelers from infected areas were isolated. Goods suspected of carrying infection were fumigated or burned. This was not a temporary emergency measure. It was a permanent institution, as routine as a tax office or a court. It had a budget. It had staff who came to work every day and did this work as their profession. It filed reports. It maintained records. It operated with bureaucratic continuity through the normal political upheavals of Venetian life. The idea that protecting the population from epidemic disease was a legitimate and permanent responsibility of the state, not a charitable intervention in emergencies, but an ongoing institutional function. This idea had existed in scattered and informal forms before the plague. After the plague, it became something that the most sophisticated governments in Europe were prepared to fund and institutionalize. The plague had demonstrated beyond any doubt that epidemic disease operated at a scale that neither individual households, nor charitable organizations, nor the church could manage. Something organized, with authority, with resources, with the power to compel compliance, something governmental was required. From these small beginnings, slow to develop and contested at every step, grew the entire edifice of modern public health. The quarantine stations, the health boards, the disease reporting systems, the vaccination programs, the epidemiological tracking, all of it descends in some meaningful institutional sense from the decrees that exhausted and frightened city administrators were improvising in the plague years. They did not know what they were founding. They were trying to survive. But what they built in order to survive became, over centuries, one of the most significant contributions to human welfare ever made. The labor shortage that the plague had created could not simply be wished away by legislation. The English Statute of Labourers had tried. It had failed. And as the decades passed, the economic logic of the new situation proved stronger than any law. A world with fewer workers could not maintain the old terms of labor forever. Serfdom in Western Europe did not end dramatically or all at once. It unwound slowly through the pressure of economics and the repeated upheavals of peasant resistance and the gradual recognition by landlords that a workforce that could leave was a workforce that had to be given reasons to stay. By the late 15th century, serfdom had largely disappeared from England. France moved more slowly, but in the same direction. Germany later still. But the direction was established. The catastrophe that had killed a third of the workforce had, in the process, given that workforce a leverage it had never possessed, and that could not be permanently revoked. From the changed position of labor, the recognition that workers had value that the old system had systematically denied, grew over generations and with enormous struggle the conditions that eventually made different economic arrangements imaginable. The free laborer of the 15th century, who could move between employers and negotiate terms and withhold his work, was the ancestor of every worker in every economy that followed. This chain of inheritance is long and broken in many places and accompanied by violence and exploitation at every stage. But it begins here, in the thinning of the labor supply that the plague produced, in the simple arithmetic of fewer people being available to do the work. The Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of art and literature and philosophy and inquiry that transformed the Italian city-states, beginning in the late 14th century and spread across Europe over the following 2 centuries. is connected to the plague in ways that historians still debate and will continue to debate. The simple claim that the plague caused the Renaissance is too simple and almost certainly wrong. The Renaissance had many roots: the recovery of classical texts, the wealth and political structure of the Italian city-states, the particular commercial culture that gave wealthy merchants reasons to patronize art and ideas. The plague did not create these conditions, but the plague altered them. It disrupted the hierarchies that had organized thought as surely as it disrupted the hierarchies that had organized labor. In a world where the Church's explanatory authority had been visibly insufficient, where inherited medical tradition had been catastrophically wrong, where the social order that had seemed permanent had been revealed as contingent. In such a world, the cost of questioning traditional authority seemed lower than it had been before, and the benefit of looking at the world directly and drawing your own conclusions seemed higher. The great Renaissance painters and sculptors, Masaccio, Donatello, Brunelleschi, and those who came after, did something that painters before them had done only rarely and tentatively. They looked at the human body and painted what they saw, not what the theological tradition told them they should see. They were interested in how flesh actually worked, how light actually fell, how a real human being standing in real space actually occupied that space. They were interested in observation. This interest was not invented by the plague, but the plague had created, in the 2 or 3 generations that followed it, a culture in which the inadequacy of received authority had been personally experienced by everyone. A culture in which the people who had trusted that the Church would explain the world and the physicians would treat its illnesses had watched both institutions fail at enormous human cost. That experience does not automatically produce Renaissance art, but it produces a world in which Renaissance art becomes possible, in which the question, "Why do you trust that?" can be asked of inherited ideas in a way it could not be asked in a world where the inherited framework appeared to be working. The new curiosity about the human body that the plague indirectly encouraged had specific and measurable consequences. The physicians who had failed so completely against the plague, whose humoral balancing and herb-stuffed masks and bloodlettings had accomplished nothing against a disease they could not see, were not uniformly chastened into abandoning medicine. Some of them were, but others emerged from the experience with something different, a determination to understand the body better than the classical authorities had managed. Not to replace observation with authority, but to begin treating observation as authoritative. Dissection of human bodies had been sporadic and controversial in Europe before the plague. Medical schools had conducted occasional public dissections for centuries, but they were rare events, conducted with elaborate ritual, governed by restrictions that made them difficult to use for genuine anatomical learning. After the plague, as medical schools reorganized themselves and began trying to understand the body's mechanisms more concretely, dissection became more common, more systematically organized, more accepted as a legitimate tool of medical education. From this shift grew, over the following 2 centuries, anatomy as a science. Andreas Vesalius published his extraordinary illustrated atlas of the human body in 1543, correcting errors in Galen that had persisted for 13 centuries, based on his own direct observations from hundreds of dissections. William Harvey demonstrated the circulation of blood in 1628. The long transformative process by which medicine gradually became a discipline based on what could be observed and tested rather than on what ancient authorities had asserted. This process has many causes and many contributors, but it is rooted, in part, in the experience of watching the ancient authorities fail and in the determination of those who witnessed the failure to eventually do better. What the Black Death left behind, in the end, was not simply ruin. The ruin was real. The empty houses and the unpainted villages and the monasteries with too few monks and the parishes with too few priests, these were real, and the people living among them were not wrong to mourn them. But the ruin was also a clearing, a terrible, unwished-for, catastrophically expensive clearing that made space for things that could not have grown in the crowded and authority-organized world of 1346. The feudal system's grip on human bodies and human labor, cracked and eventually broken by the arithmetic of survival. The Church's comprehensive explanatory authority, shaken in ways that would not fully reveal their consequences for another century and a half, but shaken. The inherited medical framework that treated classical authority as more reliable than direct observation, eventually displaced because the evidence was too powerful to ignore. None of these changes came easily. None of them came quickly. None of them came without suffering and resistance, and the particular cruelty of powerful people defending a world that was moving past them. And none of them emerged cleanly from the plague alone, without the contributions of all the human intelligence and courage and stubbornness that the intervening generations supplied. But the space was there, the clearing was real, and the people who came after the plague, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the survivors, who grew up in a world that had been rearranged by catastrophe, did something with it. There is a passage in the writing of the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, who was not born until 1333 years after a worst of the plague, and who lived through a later outbreak that touched his own region, in which he reflected on what it meant to live in a world where death arrived without announcement or reason or justice. He concluded, in the end, that the only response to mortality was presence, to live as fully as possible in the life that remained, without deferring what mattered to a future that might not arrive. He did not know that he was articulating something the survivors of the Black Death had been reaching toward in their imprecise and suffering way since 1348. He did not need to know. The thought was available to him because 7 generations of people had been living in its shadow, feeling their way toward it, painting it on church walls as dancing skeletons, writing it into the Decameron as the stories of 10 young people choosing life, enacting it in the labor markets of the changed economy as workers who knew their lives were finite and their labor was worth something. The plague was not good. Let that be stated without qualification, without the false comfort of turning catastrophe into lesson. The dead were simply dead, taken too fast, too young, too many, without meaning or justice, or the comforting narrative frame that later historians sometimes drape over the past. The grief of their survivors was real grief for real people, and it was not redeemed by the institutions built in the aftermath or the art made from the wreckage. But the world continued. It continued because human beings continue, not because they know how to, not because they are equipped for it, but because continuation is what living things do, and because inside the continuation there is always someone building something, even without knowing what they are building or why it will eventually matter. The quarantine station at Ragusa, the anatomy theatre at Padua, the free labor contract that replaced the serf's obligation, the painting on the church wall that said, "You will die, everyone dies, do not waste the time that remains." All of it built in the shadow of the worst thing that had ever happened to medieval Europe. All of it reaching, imperfectly and at great cost, toward a world slightly more capable of protecting human life, slightly more honest about the value of human time, slightly more willing to observe the world directly and trust what it saw. The mill wheel turns again. The market days resume. The fields are ploughed by fewer hands and at wages the old world would not have permitted. The world survived, changed in ways no one planned, rearranged by loss into something that the living could inhabit. Still imperfect, still full of cruelty and injustice and the ordinary suffering of ordinary people, but alive. Stubbornly, persistently, sometimes beautifully alive. This is what I carry, wanderer. Not just the names and the dates and the death tolls that historians preserve in their careful columns, but the texture of what it was to live through it. The smell of wood smoke in a Burgundy village that did not yet know what was coming. The sound of harbour officials' boots on the dock at Messina as they approached the ships they could not have imagined. The particular silence that fell over Florence in the spring of 1348, when Boccaccio walked through streets that a year earlier had been full of the noise and beauty he loved, and found them quiet in a way that city streets should never be quiet. And the other things. The physician who stayed when his colleagues fled. The woman who kept nursing strangers when she had buried everyone she personally loved. The administrators in Ragusa who, in the exhausted aftermath of catastrophe, sat down and tried to write a rule that would prevent the next one. These are the things that endure. Not because catastrophe is good, but because people are more than catastrophe, and the parts of them that are more than catastrophe leave marks in the world that outlast everything else. The plague years left their marks. We still live among them. The story we have told tonight does not end with triumph. It ends with survival, with the stubborn, unremarkable, extraordinary fact of continuation. The people of 1348 did not choose to be tested the way they were tested. They did not choose the plague, did not choose the loss, did not choose the world that was taken from them in a season. They chose only what they did with what remained, and they chose that imperfectly, as all people choose everything, some with courage, some with cowardice, some with both in the same week. They were not heroes or villains. They were people inside something too large for any individual person to fully comprehend, doing what they could. What they left behind was not simply the dance of death on church walls, not simply the emptied villages and the changed economies. They left behind the knowledge, hard-won, very expensive knowledge, that catastrophe is survivable, that institutions can be built from the experience of failure, that the body can be studied and disease can be tracked, and a government can organize itself to protect the lives of the people it governs. None of these things are small. All of them are still being practiced, imperfectly, everywhere. You have traveled a long way tonight, wanderer, from the warmth of an ordinary autumn in 1346, the mill wheel turning, the market day, the priest crossing the common with his hands folded, through the horror of what arrived on 12 ships in a Sicilian harbour, through the long, dark movement of the plague across the roads and sea lanes of a connected world that had no warning and no tools and no framework for what was happening to it. You have stood in the streets of Florence with Boccaccio. You have watched the flagellants move through the German cities in the cold, bleeding in the market squares, singing their terrible penitential songs. You have seen what catastrophe reveals about the full range of what people are capable of, the worst and the best, in the same streets, on the same days, sometimes in the same person. And you have seen what survives, what always survives, even when it seems like nothing could. The world that came after was not the world that came before. It never is, after something this large. But it was a world. A world with quarantine offices and labor contracts and anatomy classrooms and peasants who knew their work was worth something. A world where the dance of death reminded everyone who looked at it that life was finite, and that finitude was not a reason to stop living, but a reason to live with full attention while attention was still possible. Let the centuries settle around you like water. Let the dead rest where they have rested for 700 years. Let the survivors go back to their fields and their markets and their interrupted lives. You are not in that world. You are here, in the warmth of your own room, in the quiet of a night that holds nothing threatening. Let history move through you gently and then release it. Let it drift away into the long dark where all stories eventually go. You are safe. You are warm. The world survived. And so have you. Sleep well, wanderer.